I know that Gary is working hard with the upstairs and he's losing weight, but I guess Ed isn't.
That's the whole truth. An executive looks at his talent and says, talent, would you do this?
Who says Gary's losing weight?
He's got the talent.
All right, well, to go forward with our seminars, I would like to introduce my brother, who's about 4 years older than I, and has ventured to historic places and has been part of a historic place for 38 years of his professional life. So Dr. David Armour originally was born in Grove City, grew up, he called me Hick, all of my recollection life, and so we got along great. And we've had a very enjoyable time in our life with our family, following him around in different places, and one of those is Mackinac Island up in northern Michigan, and he'll be talking about a number of different things related to that and to the family history, to James Armour, our great-grandfather. So David comes with great credentials, and he is now world famous because he has a building named after him up in Mackinac City, the Mill Creek Sawmill. The visitor center was just recently, this past summer, named after him because of the work that he did. So, David, I'm going to let you go on from here. I'm his technical support person.
Yeah, I'm not very techie.
And I think you will very much
closer
enjoy
to this guy than
very much enjoyed his presentation. He's been very much involved in doing geological research with our family, and of course that broadens out to our mother's family and Grace's family, his wife's family, and it just goes on and on and on. But I think he might mention cousin Jake in the midst of all this, but that's part of the genealogical activity that goes on in between people exchanging information and what it does. So David, you're on.
I'm on, so I can have lights, and I need that little gizmo that
That's
lets
help.
me advance the picture, so it's about as techie as I get. I'll probably screw that up.
Lights out.
Yeah, lights out. My brother kind of introduced it. You come into this room and as an armor, you look up on the wall and there's our name. And my dad's handiwork's all around here. This place at Mackinac Island is where I spent 36 years as the manager of Fort Mackinac and Mackinac Island State Park and two other historic parks. One is Fort Michilimackinac, the 18th century fort in Mackinac City, and historic Mill Creek, which is a late 18th century, early 19th century sawmill site, a working sawmill. That's where in June I was greatly honored to have a building named after me, and the thing that was remarkable was that I have been retired for 5 years. So my former associates didn't forget me completely, they honored me. I retired in the year 2003, and about the end of September, so at the end of this month I've been retired 5 years. And when I worked at Mackinac, I did a lot of historical research on many different people, and I wrote books and published things. But what I always wanted to do in my retirement was work on my, I don't know, did I push the wrong button? No. I'll go back. Hold this thing and I punch wrong things sometimes. I always wanted to work on my own family's history. And the Armours have been around western Pennsylvania as long as Grove City has been here. They came in 1798, at least they were here in 1798. And the first one to come was a guy named Hamilton Armour. His dad, Robert Armour, had been a soldier in the Revolution and had the misfortune to get killed. His orphan son moved to Carlisle, got married, eventually moved out here in western Pennsylvania. He ended up having 5 sons. One was named after himself, Hamilton. There was a Robert, a Thomas. There was a James, this rather scary looking individual, and Samuel. Most of the people with an Armour name today in Mercer County, Crawford County, are probably descended from Hamilton Armour. We don't have a good genealogical network. On my side, Armours are not very historically interested. And until I came along and began to bring stuff together, stuff just kind of got dispersed. They settled in, not in Mercer County, they settled in Crawford County, which is the county just north. They settled on the southern boundary almost of Crawford County, which meant they were just about a mile or less from Mercer County. And my grandfather, who was known locally around here as TF or Fred, his real name was Thomas Frederick, but he moved here to Grove City in 1923, and my father and my mother both attended Grove City High School, graduated in 1925, went on to Grove City College, each of them for 2 years, and a number of years later they got married in 1936, and immediately bought a house on East Washington Boulevard, where my brother Tom lives today. That's the house I grew up in. And let's see, I ran around with a bunch of friends, and even my brother, this guy in the coonskin cap over here on the right.
That was Hick.
That was Hick, that's my brother. And you can see we had kind of a historical interest. He's wearing a coonskin cap, and I am actually carrying a long rifle, a Pennsylvania or Kentucky rifle. And reasons I got fascinated with that, come on in, Marshall, was that when my parents bought that house on East Washington Boulevard, in a closet, somebody, previous owner, had left a Pennsylvania rifle. And so I grew up with this thing, and we carted it around, believe it or not. I would take it down to Washington School where I went and dress up in Halloween and take the gun into the classroom, you know, all these things that, ooh, you wouldn't dare do that today. That's the way we did it. And I grew up during World War II, so military things were very much a part of my life. And we played soldier, and we even played, this isn't as good a kepi as he's got, but we played, and this was one of the ones I had from when I was a kid. But I had friends who were interested in history, interested in hunting, the outdoors, and things like that. And so I became kind of interested in the Civil War, and I talked to my grandfather, this is TF, this is his Mary, my step-grandmother. He had 3 wives eventually, but the last one he married when he was 85 years old, and they married this young girl who was only 80. She did outlive him. But he always had a good mind, he was a good storyteller, and he talked a little bit about his dad. His dad had been a soldier in the Civil War, and that's who I'll be talking more about. TF was born in 1876. So he was born just 11 years after the end of the Civil War. His dad told him some stories which he passed down through the family, not in great detail, but enough to pique my interest. He said that his father had gone in, when he joined up, he went in as a substitute for somebody else who paid him $300 to go in. Instead of being drafted, he took the substitute pay and went in, and that was an interesting story. They had substitutes, and my great-grandfather had gone in that way. He also told a story about a kepi. He said that when my great-grandfather was in the Army, he had a kepi like our friend has here, and at some point, not in a battle, but maybe when it was in his tent, a bullet came through the tent and went through his hat. And to have a kepi with a bullet hole in it was kind of a badge of courage. Showed you had been somewhere that was dangerous to be. And so he wore his kepi with the bullet hole in it, and he was very proud of it. And we'll learn what happened to it. Now, I was interested in guns, as you could tell from those pictures of us boys out roaming around. This was the home that my grandfather grew up in. This was the Armour homestead, just off of Route 19. Route 19 goes right past this property. They had a 107-acre farm. And this picture, nobody was living in it at the time. This was getting very dilapidated, and now it doesn't exist anymore. This is my father, Arthur, with me going out to prowl around that site and pick up a few artifacts, one of which my brother has at his garage. It's a weather vane lightning rod. But I wanted to go here when I was young, because I thought maybe, because I didn't know too much, I thought maybe my great-grandfather had brought his gun home at the end of the war. And I was hoping that the gun existed, and it might be up in the attic of this house. My great aunt, my grandfather's sister-in-law, or his brother's wife, brother was dead by this time, lived in this house. And I talked to her about getting up in the attic, in this area where the window is, and she was very reluctant to let me look around. So I got my grandfather one day, and he was very good with people. If any of you knew my grandfather, you would know that. I said, I got an objective. I want to go to this house, I want to get up in the attic, and you're going to have to talk your way in there. And it took him about an hour or so of talking before he let us go up this little stairway to the attic. And then she told me something that was very horrific. She said, we just cleaned out the attic, you know. They had a lot of stuff up there. And we cleaned it out, and so a lot of it's gone. And many of you heard those kind of stories before if you're searching, and your heart kind of sinks. But we did get up there, and I found a treasure. In a trunk, I found this letter. This letter was written by my great-grandfather, the closing days of the Civil War, and it was really there. I have the real thing in a file. I brought some folders and stuff over here, some of the stuff I'm showing you so you can look at it. I don't know how this thing survived, but it was there, and I latched onto it. I latched onto some other stuff that my grandfather said, oh, that's my rocking chair, oh, this is my high chair, oh, this is the chair I used to sit in. So we did pick up a few other things, but the only written document that related to the Civil War experience was this letter, which to me was a great treasure, and I'll share this with you in a little bit. So I started to do some research. So what could I find out about this guy? Since they didn't really have any records in the homestead. And so I wrote to the National Archives, and I began to get copies of some of his enlistment papers and muster lists, and I learned that he was in the 211th Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment, and that he was in Company D. By knowing a regimental number and a company number, it lets you track people around. We'll talk a little more about that. So I got some of these documents. You can't read them here, but I have them in the book. And then I got this book. This is a place where anybody doing research on Pennsylvania soldiers goes to this book, because this is a multi-volume history of every unit. And so you look up 211th Pennsylvania, it gives you a list of everybody that was in that unit, what happened to them. And so here's James Armour, who's my great-granddaddy. Name was in there, and showed him in Company D. Somewhere along the line, I learned that the battle flags from many of these Pennsylvania units still exist. And they were down in Harrisburg, and it was a big project to kind of restore them, take care of them. I had never been and seen it actually, but I was able to get a photograph of it. And so that is the battle flag that his regiment, the 211th, carried into battle. And up in the upper corner there's some little ribbons, and they have the names of the various engagements that this unit was in. Once I learned a little bit about where they had fought, I wanted to go see the real places. I am a historian by profession. I'm a historic site manager, was what I did. I liked the real place, and I wanted to go see where it really was. And so this was a place, we'll talk more about what happened here. It's a fort called Fort Sedgwick. It's in Petersburg National Historic Park, and I wanted to see it. My kids didn't want to go see it. My wife went along, all right. I dragged my kids along. We went walking around on this, and then the park ranger came and said, "Get off that mound of dirt." And I should have known better, I guess. But anyway, I went there a second time with my grandchildren, who were a little more interested in being there, and there were signs and displays to help you to understand what had happened. Also, on the last trip that I went with my granddaughters, we went to see a monument that had been erected by the Pennsylvania units at Petersburg. Petersburg is south of Richmond, Virginia. And my great-grandfather fought at this site, and this was a place. We'll talk a little more about what happened there. I had an incredible experience of serendipity. As I was researching what this unit had done, I saw listed in an advertisement a book which was a diary of a soldier who had been at Petersburg. That's all it said in the advertisement. So I invested a few bucks, ordered the book, not knowing really what it was. I got the book, which I have here too. This guy was in the 211th Pennsylvania. And that means that whatever he was recording, where he was every day, what the weather was like, what they were doing, and he kept a daily diary, and it was fairly long entries. So I could follow my great-granddaddy around by reading this book. It was incredible to find that kind of a source. So let's follow him around a little bit. This is the young man who was my great-grandfather. James Armour, born in 1843, lived until 1906. He served as a private in the 211th Pennsylvania in Company D. He was only in the Army about 9 months, but he came home at the end, which is not a small achievement. Because the Civil War, by 1864, when he went in, had been a very, very bloody conflict. And they had to draft people, you know, to join up because so many had been killed. And a draft was instituted in 1864, and the draft age was from 20 years old to 45 years old. And bachelors were to be drafted first. So here's this young man, just turned 20 years old, a bachelor. His name was high on the list, and each state, like Pennsylvania, and each county had a quota. And so he knew his chances were very high of being drafted, but when his neighbor, his name was Thomas Dilly, who lived in just over the line in Mercer County, offered him $300 to go in his place, because he knew he was going to be drafted. This young man, who was 6'1" tall with red hair, had been a farmer all his life, talked to his cousin, who lived not too far away, whose name was Robert Armour, who was older than him, and he was going to be drafted too, and they decided they would walk up to Meadville, the county seat for Crawford County, and join up. And so they did, on September 3rd of 1864, and were inducted into the United States Army by signing their names on a volunteer enlistment certificate and signed up in the 211th Pennsylvania. They received a bounty from the federal government, $100 for joining up, but the feds are really tight. They only gave him a third of that 100. I think you maybe had to survive, or sometime in the future they'd give you the rest of it. And they got paid $13 a month for being soldiers. After a number of men had signed up in Meadville, they went down south of Pittsburgh to a place called Camp Reynolds. At Camp Reynolds, this is where the 211th kind of assembled. I don't know exactly how they got from Meadville to Camp Reynolds. I assume they went by railroad train, but I don't know the exact train layout. At Camp Reynolds, the regiment, the 211th, was beginning to be organized. Now, a regiment has approximately 1,000 soldiers in it. And since this is the 211th Pennsylvania, that means that over the Civil War time, there were over 200,000 men from Pennsylvania who had joined up in Pennsylvania units. He was assigned to Company D. Now, a company is approximately 100 men in each company, and his company had about 98. And the company that he was assigned to, Company D, was a Mercer County company, because both he and Robert had taken the place of young men from Mercer County. And he was assigned to Sandy Creek Township, Mercer County. That's whose quota he filled. The second lieutenant of this company was named Thomas C. Gilson. Well, that was important to me because one of my playmates when I was young was a guy named David Gilson, who still lives out on Cranberry Road, and George Gilson, who is deceased. But these guys who lived just down the block from me had a sword from the Civil War that their lieutenant ancestor had carried. You know, and played with that a little bit when I was growing up, and so that was something very tangible that really had turned me on. And so this Thomas Gilson was the person who was lieutenant of the company that he was in. At Camp Reynolds, which is very close to where Braddock was defeated during the French and Indian War, and it was in the town of Braddock, that's the south side of Pittsburgh. They were issued a uniform, which looks like this, or if our friend would just stand up a minute. Here, we were very fortunate today. We got somebody who is dressed in the type of uniform that James Armour would have worn. And he'd look a lot like this guy.
Just move over a little bit, be in the light. Close your eyes.
There he is. Thank you very much. He didn't bring his gun with him, which is quite appropriate because James Armour didn't get a rifle down in Camp Reynolds
Who made your
either.
coat?
Who made my coat? A sutler in Gettysburg made this. S&S is a family-owned sutler.
Yeah.
This is a school kill pattern. There were several other patterns of sack coats in use by Union soldiers in the Civil War. This is a school kill pattern, not a sack coat.
At Camp Reynolds, that's where this fellow who kept the diary joined the unit. And so from that day on September 17th of 1864, we have a daily account of much of what James Armour experienced. And we know that on that day, these guys who were coming in from the countryside, didn't know much about soldiering, didn't have any guns, got on a train. And the train took them to Baltimore, where they slept in the depot. Then they got another train, took them to Washington, D.C. And while they were in Washington, D.C. and resting up, they handed him a gun. And it was a .58 caliber Springfield rifled musket, like up there at the top. Got a bayonet, got cartridge boxes, cap boxes, and they were all outfitted. They didn't have any training on how to use this thing, but they got it. And after they got outfitted with it, they marched through Washington, D.C. Probably, maybe they didn't even march in step very well because they didn't have much training. And then they got on a steamboat called the Kennebec and began to head down towards the front. The Civil War, they passed this place. I'll show you a map in a minute where it is, City Point, which was the major staging point for a big siege which was going on at a railroad junction town called Petersburg, south of Richmond. James Armour came from up here on a train, Baltimore, and he went on another train to Washington. And then he got on a boat, and that boat took him down here, then to Chesapeake Bay, down here, up the river, to City Point. And then they didn't get off there, they'll transfer you over to this other map. They came up this river, City Point, then they went the opposite bank to a place which was called Bermuda 100. This area is the same as this area on this map. This is Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, and a few miles south was Petersburg, a railroad junction where all the supplies for Richmond came in. That's why it was so critical. So General Grant was trying to capture Richmond, and he was extending his Union lines down this way and had encircled Petersburg, and were trying to get around it and cut it off. This siege went on for months. It had been going on for quite a while before James ever got there. The red lines are the Confederate lines, the blue lines are the Union ones, he got off his boat right here, went over to this blue line, this, and facing the red line. So that's where his military career began. A place called Bermuda Hundred. This is less than 3 weeks after he joined the Army. And he hasn't had any training. And here he is with a bunch of guys he doesn't know except his cousin. And they get off this boat, they camp, and they could hear the cannons firing. And then they march them towards the front. I mean, right where the dirt's piled up and where the sandbags are piled up. And then they get the unit in a line and they say, step up on the sandbags. Yeah. So this regiment, these 1,000 guys, stand up in full view of the enemy on these sandbags. Some officer thought it would be a good idea to show the enemy that we got lots of reinforcements. And so they stood up, Confederates shot a cannon at them, killed a couple of them real quick. And I suspected they jumped down real quick too. But what a way to be introduced to the military. This is 26 days after he enlisted. It's only 10 days after they left Pittsburgh on that train ride. Now they're getting shot at, they're seeing people killed. They had a funeral the next day, and they were camping out in tents. It was raining. Sanitation wasn't very good. They didn't know how to take care of a camp. And a third of the soldiers came down with typhoid fever. And James and his cousin Robert got sick as well. And thus, they ended up here in a hospital at Point of Rocks, Virginia. And they stayed there for October. They went in on the 5th of October. They stayed there in October, November, and December. And they weren't recovered enough to come out of the hospital until January. In some ways, he was lucky not to have been out there with the rest of the soldiers, because at that place where they got up on that parapet and got shot at, the rest of the soldiers stayed near there. And one night, Confederates came on a special raid and captured a bunch of them. In fact, out of his company, that 100 guys company, 10 of them were captured, and thus set out the rest of the war. He missed that. He also missed his unit being moved from down closer to Petersburg, and another raid that they had gone on. So he missed all that stuff, which was probably lucky. When he did get out in January, they moved into winter quarters. Winter quarters meant you just kind of hung around and tried to stay warm and to do some different duty, but usually the soldiers built kind of log cabins and put tents over the top, made something that was fairly dry and not too bad if you could stay there for a while, if they didn't keep moving you around. James was in a reserve unit, which meant that he was not on the front lines. He was back behind the front lines, but it was cold, it was rainy. They spent their time trying to learn how to be soldiers, how to drill, drilling meant how to use that gun, but also how to move your troops around as a group, so that one soldier doesn't go over here, another one goes over there, that this 1,000 soldiers can do something as a unit, and to do it fairly quickly, and to go to the right places. They could tell that the war was kind of going in the Union favor, because quite frequently Confederate deserters from Petersburg would come pass through their camp. They weren't quite sure what they might be doing. They anticipated they might have to be involved in some kind of an attack on the Confederate lines, but a few times they'd all line up and get ready to march someplace, and then they cancel it. I guess that's the way the military works. This, you know, you've heard this phrase, hurry up and wait. So they did a lot of that hurry up and wait stuff. By this time it was getting into mid-March. And in mid-March it got warmer. There's down Virginia. And they all had big winter overcoats, which they felt they weren't going to need anymore, and so they packed them all up and sent them off to Washington. But mostly it was kind of a waiting game. But it changed on March 25th. This is a map of Petersburg. This are the Confederate lines. The Union lines are in blue. And up here, it was a place where it was very close between the Confederate line and the Union line. And the Confederates were starting to get desperate. And they wanted to break the siege. And they decided they would try to break out of Petersburg right through this line, get over farther, and cut. This is a railroad line. That's a railroad line which the Union had to supply their army. They wanted to break through here, break through this line, and hopefully cause the Union to go away. Well, so in the night, or very early in the morning, on March 25th, the Confederates, in really a last gasp of the Confederate Army, launched a major attack on a fort called Fort Stedman, which is up in this area that I pointed out. The idea was to come across in the very early morning, capture that fort, keep going. They did come across and captured the fort, but there was a depth of Union lines. There were other forts nearby. There were other lines of entrenchments, and they didn't get very far. Now, James' Armour in the 211th was down this way, and they could hear all this shooting going on. They were about 4 miles south. This is Fort Stedman, this is Confederate line. They were down in this area, and they were reserve unit. And so when the Confederates had captured this fort, the word came to the 211th, get up to this place quick. And so they got up and they began to march very fast. They had 4 miles to march. They came marching up this way to a place on the railroad called Meade Station. This area is a hill, so that they were shielded from the fighting by being on the other side of this hill. When they got up here, they got organized. And the plan was for them to attack, to recapture the fort. This shows the battle line of the 211th. There are other Union groups here, but they waited to attack until the 211th got there. They marched up quickly. They were about a mile back from the fort. And then they formed up in a line. And they put on their bayonets. A little device like this. And they lined up probably about 600 of them, because a lot of them are sick in hospital, some of them killed, captured. About 600 guys in line, and with their bayonets, they came marching up over the brow of this hill. And again, they were to be sort of a show group, so that the Confederates who had captured this place could look up on the hill and see this big line of 1,000 soldiers coming down on them. Of course, they were in full view, so they could get shot at all the way down there, too. So they had to march about a mile down to the fort while people were shooting at them. I think they were pretty scared. But they kept marching as they were supposed to, and with their fixed bayonets. And when they came down, the other regiments also charged out as well, and the rebels saw them coming and began to lose hope of what they were doing. Some of them began to turn and run. And so as they marched down, this is the 211th in a modern display, which is on site at Fort Stedman. Here they are, their unit and their battle flag, marching down, and they were able to recapture that fort, actually able to capture about 600 Confederates. They had rather light casualties, because Confederates had kind of turned and were starting to get out of there. The color guard, who was carrying the flag, got killed. 10 of the soldiers were wounded, but it was pretty light casualties that day. And then after they had recaptured the fort, they had a truce, which was fairly common to do, to stop fighting for a little while so both sides could come out, pick up their wounded and their dead, and take care of the casualties on the battlefield. It was one thing that was quite remarkable about this little engagement was that President Abraham Lincoln had come out to Petersburg on this day. He was going to have a regimental review. A lot of soldiers were going to march past him and impress him, and he was there. And he was on a hill and watched the 211th go down the hill and recapture Fort Stedman. He's reported to have remarked that this is far better than a review. He got to watch an actual battle. Once that battle, which didn't last very long, once it was over, they went back to their camp, which was 5 miles away, and settled in, wondering when the next attack is going to be. They knew what battle was like because they'd just been through it. On March the 31st, this is 6 days later, they got woken up at 1 o'clock. They marched out to an attack. There was a terrific cannonade going on, and about 300 guns were firing. It was an awful noise. They thought, here we go. Then the attack was canceled. Turned around, went back to their camp. A few days later, the attack was for real. On April 1st, they were marched out again to attack a Confederate fort called Fort Mahone, which was well fortified. This is kind of the Confederate or the Civil War barbed wire. These kind of devices with sharp, pointy things held together by a central pole. They're called chevaux de frise, which is really a device that stops horses. But the place that they were going to attack was very, very well fortified. There's a place called Fort Mahone. These are Confederate lines. They were dirt ramparts. They had a ditch in front of them filled with water. In front of the ditch, they had those kind of spike things. And then they had a lot of trees that were laid down, kind of a big, they call it abattis, which is just a lot of trees that make it hard to walk fast. All these are impediments to slow you down while you're trying to get to this place and capture it. These lines were only from, this is the Union line, this is the Confederate line. They're only half a mile apart. They were both on little hills, So the ground sloped down this way and sloped up this way. There was a little creek that ran down the middle, and the goal was to run from here to there while they're shooting at you and try to get over it. It's not a very happy type of thing to expect. On Sunday, April 2nd, James Armour and his cohorts were sent out in the night at 3 o'clock in the morning. They were moved out in front of the fort lines and told to lay down in the field in front of the Union fort and to be very, very quiet so that these people won't know you're there. And so they moved out and lay down in silence, 3 o'clock in the morning. And at 4 o'clock, all heck broke loose. The cannons opened up, began to shell the Confederate side. They did it only for 20 minutes, and they stopped. It was quiet. And then they heard boom, 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 3 shots. That meant get up and go at it. They were told not to load their rifles, to use just the bayonet, and to do it fast. They rushed forward. There were specially trained soldiers at the front of their column who had axes to cut through this stuff. And as soon as they got to it, they started whacking away. As soon as the Confederates heard that, they started shooting. And they kept rushing on, the whole mass of soldiers. James Armour and his group, 211th, was right here, going in this line. There were other groups beside them. This was a road, Jerusalem Plank Road, and this was the ground they had to cover while they're being shot at. Cannons and rifles. My grandfather said, his dad said that he still remember hearing those mini balls whistle past them. I have a mini ball here, which you can see later. And this was what was going through the air. And if it hit you, it made a big impact on you. They rushed forward, got down through that ditch, covered in water, clambered up the muddy slope, and then they were in hand-to-hand combat with this sort of stuff. And there were so many of the Union there that they were able to overpower the Confederates. They were able to capture 400, I don't know what happened, 400 Confederate prisoners, 8 cannon, and 2 Confederate battle flags, which is one of the trophies that you were always trying to get. They got one from North Carolina and one from Alabama. Battle went on all day. Each soldier carried a cartridge pouch that had 40 rounds in it. Well, after a while, you used up your 40 shots, biting off the tip of your cartridge, pouring it down the front of your musket, pushing it down, putting a cap on it, shooting it, doing it again, maybe laying in the mud, probably. The Confederates, who had been driven back to their second line of defense, counterattacked at 11 o'clock. So here comes the Confederates, and you're laying there and you're shooting at them. They drove them off. 2 hours later, 1 o'clock, they come back again. And the Union, James Armour's there shooting his gun, and they're coming, but they stop them. Wait a couple hours, they come again, 3rd time. And again, this Union group stopped them. The 211th was kind of disorganized. It wasn't really a unit anymore. Soldiers were kind of scattered around. And the firing continued until dark. And when dark time came, they pulled these soldiers back and let them put some other soldiers in their place. The soldiers just dropped. And they'd been fighting for 16 hours straight. They had been resupplied with more ammunition, so they shot more than their 40 shots and got some more. But when they came back, they were just wiped out. In that engagement, they had lost 4 officers killed, 17 enlisted men killed, and wounded 4 officers, 89 enlisted men wounded, and 21 who knew where they were. They were just missing. So out of a total of 900 and, let's say around 900 soldiers in the 211th, in this one battle, their casualties were 135. One battle, one day, casualties 15%. As they lay there that night, they heard a big explosion in Petersburg. What was happening is that the Confederate Army had decided, General Lee had decided he had to get his soldiers out of Petersburg. And they began to run for it westward in Virginia, and the Union Army was after them. The Union pickets, the advance people, went into Petersburg, looked around, saw that the Confederates had all left. And so James Armour and the 211th marched into Petersburg on April 3rd, 1865, playing Yankee Doodle as they all marched in. They were very, very happy, celebrating as they came in, and then they began to follow the Confederates who were going westward, and the 211th followed a railroad line. This is Petersburg, this is the Appomattox River. They followed this line westward, and they got about this far. Other Unions split off and were chasing them this way. The red shows where the Confederates are going west from Petersburg, also from Richmond. They're pulling out all their soldiers, heading west, and the Union were right on their tail. And of course, they caught them at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, where the Confederate Army surrendered. It was on April 10th, that's 7 days after Petersburg fell, that James Armour got word that the Confederates had surrendered. Everybody was excited. You can imagine that, to have Lee's army, the Confederate Army, surrendered. The officers in his unit were a little bit afraid that the soldiers might decide this is a good time to go home. And so in order to keep them there, they had roll call 5 times a day and count them off and see whether the soldiers are really still there, because they didn't quite trust them. And they began to see some of the Union soldiers coming back from, farther west, coming back along